Alright, we're going to be looking at Cbet Flop OP. This is going to be the solver module. So we're going to start by trying to get a very broad idea of what the solver does in the Cbet Flop OP scenario, and we're going to make use of GTO Wizard in doing that. Now when we're using something like GTO plus the solver, we have a mode that's known as scripting mode, and basically allows us to solve for a whole bunch of flops. So we could have 50 flops, 100 flops, that kind of thing. And if we solve for everything, all of those flops, then we can start comparing them. Now, one of the advantages of pre-solved solution is that that's already been done. So it's possible to just bring up an overview of how to play on every flop. And we actually mean every single flop. We're not talking about a subset of flops. We're talking about every flop. So let's just take a quick look at how this works. And I've seen that sometimes this loads up, sometimes it doesn't. So we'll see if it loads up this time. And first of all, we're going to put in a specific scenario. So we've got our tree selected. And here are our decision nodes. So we're going to imagine a situation where small blind open raises and big blind calls. We then get the option to select a flop, but instead of select a flop, we have this report option. So very similar to what you can do with PO Solver or GTO Plus. The only difference here is everything is already pre-solved, so it's just a case of pulling in those solutions. So let's see how it does this time. So one of the things that I noticed is that a single game tree can sometimes be fairly large, talking like 20 to 30 meg. So you can imagine all of them. Of course, it's probably not pulling in all of the game trees. It's probably just pulling in an overview of how to play on each of these flops. And that's what we see right now. We see every single flop in Hold'em that can appear in this situation. And we see an overview of the different frequencies. Now, just to give you an idea of the tree that we're running right now, you can see the sizings over on the right-hand side. So there's 6 big blinds in the middle because it was a 3 big blind open raise. And the solver's got the option to bet 2, so that's 33% pot, bet 3 half pot, 75% pot, which is 4.5, and then the overbet of 7.5 into the 6 big blind pot. And you can see how the colors work there. We've got green, which is a check. All of the betting decisions are red, but the larger the sizing, the darker the red color. So we've got bet 2 is quite a light red color, but the overbet is quite a dark red color. Now, if we look at this bottommost row here, we can actually see an overview of every flop. We can navigate along it. And even in that broad overview, we can see the colors. We can see a few interesting things. So the breakdown here is that, firstly, we don't bet too much. So those values for the bet sizings are the overall Cbet frequencies irrespective of board texture for playing in this heads-up Cbet OP scenario. And without adding up the betting frequencies, we can just look at the check frequency there, which is 57.8. So that's going to tell us the betting frequency on average is going to be around 40%. So in terms of what would we expect for our Cbet Flop OP HUD stat if we were playing close to GTO, well, we would expect about 40%. If we have 20% flop Cbet OP, we're technically playing less aggressive than GTO on the flop, for example. This is part of the reason why I suspect that players who check their entire range, regardless of the flop, may be missing out on some expectation. It's not optimal, but we can see from a theory point of view, it is below 50%. 42% or whatever is recommended by the solver here. So we can see that from the overview. Another example of something we can deduce from this is that although the average board texture is Cbet with a very low frequency from a GTO perspective, there are some outliers. So if we look along this bottom row here of the different flops, you see that there are certain textures that really jump out. For example, 666. And if I hover over the 666 texture, and this is not necessarily a super high frequency board, the 666, but we can see that the betting frequency is very high on this texture. So if you look at the bottom right window for this specific texture down here, you can see the distribution of different options on that specific texture. So on a 666, it's using the 75% sizing 50% of the time. Then it's using the half pot sizing 35.7 and the underbet sizing 12.2%. It basically never checks. And if we jump along the grid to the other boards which are bet at a very high frequency, we've got 777. Scroll along, we've got 888. So you can kind of see the pattern here. These are all of the trips textures where we're supposed to bet at a super high frequency, OP as the PFR. Now there are other textures which are not trip textures but are still supposed to be bet at a fairly high frequency. And one of the options here we have with GTO Wizard is the sorting option. So we can actually sort by the frequency of various decisions. So if we were to sort by bet 3, for example, we'd get the boards that use that sizing the most frequently. And that doesn't seem to be super useful. Let's try bet 4.5. Let's try bet 2. What we can do as well is we can sort by boards that check. And you can see we get a really smooth distribution there where the boards with the highest checking frequency are over on the right hand side. And it appears there are some textures that almost exclusively check. So if we just have a look at these and figure out what the pattern is, well, we've got 654, 543, 765. Just looking along these boards, these are all fairly low boards. Some of them are wheel boards, and that's basically a unique board for big blind versus small blind situation. I mean, we can check the same boards in other positions as well. But let's just say big blind cold call against a small blind open is going to hit those wheel and lower textures especially hard. When we say wheel textures, we mean 5 cards between, or 3 cards between a deuce and a 5. So, you know, deuce 3, 4, 5, 4, deuce, all of that stuff. You can see we're supposed to almost exclusively check on those textures. Now, scrolling along, we'll see there's another category of board that has a very low Cbet frequency as well. And that is the monotone textures. Now, that might seem kind of surprising. Let's just have a look at some of these. Now, the Ace-King 6 has got some overbetting going on there, you can see. Whereas the Ace-9-6 still bets at low frequencies, not doing as much overbetting. Now, the reason why this might seem surprising is because this is actually one of our hotspot textures. Not the 4-3 deuce, the Ace-9-6. One of our hotspot textures, so we actually bet here at a fairly high frequency. If we don't have some kind of mid-range flush draw, we're going to be betting. Of course, we will have a flush draw a decent amount, but the rest of the time we're going to be betting. So we expect a fairly high betting frequency on this texture. So one of the takeaways here is that although we like to bet very aggressively on monoboards as an exploit, well, it is an exploit according to GTO, because you can see this monoboard, the solver is recommending we check 91.6% of the time, and if we do bet, we bet fairly small. And you'll see all of the other mono textures are going to be in this part of the grid as well as we scroll along. You can see that there are other mono textures there. Quite a few mono textures. Some of them are obviously bet more frequently than the others. So if we take, for example, 874, you can see the betting frequency is going up slightly. So that's now check 72.6. So we don't want to say that we should always be checking on every mono texture, but if we check the other end of the grid, well, can you see any mono textures there? There are no mono textures. Let's see what the first mono texture is we can spot out of the list. So still none. There's some two-tone there, but no mono so far. And there we go. We're seeing a mono that's fairly high up in the list there. We've got the 8-4 deuce. And we can see the checking frequency is 57.9. So you can see there are some mono textures that might be bet as aggressively as 40%. But as a general guide, we're actually not supposed to bet so aggressively as we do in practice on monoboards. Now, if we take a look at the other end of the spectrum, well, we know that the trips boards are supposed to be bet at a very high frequency from GTO. In fact, all of those highest frequency bet boards are actually trip textures. Let's see what the first boards that aren't trips are. So we've got Ace A7, so we're getting into the paired boards territory. And we can see that the paired boards that make their way into the high betting frequency first are the paired aces. So even from GTO perspective, we're supposed to attack those boards quite aggressively. And you can kind of see as we go along as well what the distribution of overbets is. So you can see with those ace-ace exports, there isn't really a lot of overbetting that goes on. So we've got underbet, very, very frequent on that. And then some of the time we are betting half pot, but we virtually never bet 75 or overbet. Although you can see the solver does have some overbets. You've got 0.5%, 75% pot, and 0.3% overbet. But keep in mind, these solves are not 100% accurate as well. So the obvious question is, if this particular solution had been run to a Nash distance of 0, would we still have that overbet and 3/4 sizing? And we might do, but looking at it, it seems like it's probably trending towards 0, and we would only be using the 1/3 and half pot. So usually what this means, when we see this kind of strategy, there's usually an implication there that the aggressor has a fairly big range advantage, but doesn't necessarily have a big nutted equity distribution component. Whereas if we have a look at some of the textures with the overbets, we usually find that not only does the aggressor have a significant equity advantage, range versus range, but they also have a much bigger nutted component of holdings. So if you think about, what is the nuts on an ace-6, for example? Well, the nuts, aside from pocket aces, which is one combo, so we could kind of ignore that, but, technically aces is not in the cold caller's range. What do we have after that? Well, we have stuff like ace-6, but that's in both players' range usually, right? The small blind is possibly opening that, but the big blind's defending that as well against a small blind open. So ace-6 is in both players' range. Then pocket sixes, again, it's in both players' ranges. So you can see that although the small blind's range might be stronger than the big blind's range, they're chopping with respect to that nutted equity distribution on this specific texture. So that's going to apply to a lot of these ace-ace exports. Now, just to think about this from the same idea, but now with a 4-4-4 texture. Well, what is the nuts on a 4-4-4? Okay, there's quads, and both players may have quads, but what are the stronger holdings after quads? Well, on this kind of texture, it's pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks, and all of those are holdings which are fairly impervious to being outdrawn. They're fairly robust. They have very, very good equity. But they're also holdings that are not going to be in the cold caller's range. So when small blind open raises, he has pocket aces, but when big blind cold calls, he doesn't have that. He's probably going to have something like pocket 10s and lower. He might even 3-bet 10s and 9s and even 8s with some frequency in this spot. So what ends up happening? There ends up being a much more pronounced advantage in the nutted regions. So you can see a darker red color there. Now, it's not actually using the overbet sizing. We'll see if there's boards that are using that. Well, it is, but it's a low frequency. And I suppose overbets are going to be fairly low frequency anyway. But you can see most of the sizings in that 75% pot range. And we see kind of similar on, 6-6-6, 5-5-5, deuce-deuce-deuce, 3-3-3, stuff like that. So if we keep on going, we get the king-king-5, king-king-6, ace-ace-5. Those are fairly similar. So we've got a paired high card and a disconnected low card. You can see once again high betting frequency, but generally small sizing. So let's keep moving down the list. And you can see the betting frequency is starting to drop. Having said that, these are fairly high given that the decision node we're talking about is Cbet flop OP. Now we're noticing there's a couple here which are darker red. And what this means is they're using the overbet sizing some of the time. We've got King Jack 10. That's actually got 4.1%. And then we've got Queen Jack 10. And this is a pattern you're going to see as well. If you spot something that has 3 broadways, and this also applies to spots where we're playing in position as the PFR as well. In fact, it applies in lots of situations where we're the last pre-flop actor, with the last pre-flop aggressor, and our opponent has just called against our aggressive action pre-flop. These 3 or even 2 Broadway textures are going to give the aggressor a much bigger nutted equity component to his range. So, if you think about Queen Jack 10, for example, well, what's the nuts in Queen Jack 10? Well, it's Ace King. Does the cold caller have that? Probably not. What are the next strongest hands? Well, there's 8-9, and admittedly, the cold caller might have that. And, even King 9 as well, to some extent. But, you know, then there's things like queens, jacks, and tens, which the cold caller maybe doesn't have. I'm not sure exactly how many combos the solver's giving him of king 9, for example. But, you know, it's possible he may 3-bet some of those pre-flop. So you can see there's some nutted holdings in the aggressor's range. I mean, even if it's just all 16 combos of ace-king, which are completely in the aggressor's range, but not in the defender's range. And obviously with queen, jack, 10, it kind of interacts with like the 8-9 region, whereas if we take something like king, jack, 10, it's going to interact even less with the cold callers region, etc. Let's keep moving. So you'll see some other boards like that. In fact, anytime you see something that's dark red, it's probably going to have multiple broadways. So if we just pick those out, queen, jack, 10, queen, jack, 10 here, ace, jack, 6. Now this is now a 2 Broadway region texture, but it's still overbet some of the time. And you can see, looking at the distribution, that's the kind of texture where, if you look at the sizings over on the right-hand side, a lot of the time it's either going to be an overbet or it's going to be a small bet, but not really so much in the middle. So kind of a little bit more polarized in terms of the bet sizing we use. King, queen, 6. Again, very similar thing. It's like, it's a 2 Broadway texture. Ace, jack, 10, 3 Broadways. You can see some overbetting going on there. Let's keep on moving. So again, we've got like multiple Broadways, 2 Broadway textures. So you can see anything with 2 Broadway cards has got the overbet sizing in with some frequency. In fact, if we were to also sort this, and we can actually sort by overbet sizing and say, okay, which boards overbet the most? So from the right hand side, we've got ace, jack, 7, 2 Broadways, ace, jack, 7, ace, king, 3, ace, king, 3, ace, king, 5, ace, king, deuce, ace, king, deuce, ace, king, 4, ace, queen, 4. Start to see a pattern, right? In fact, when does that pattern break? Everything has exactly 2 Broadways. When do the cards stop having 2 Broadways? Let's see if we can figure that out. The slide is not cooperating 100%. Well, we've got some creeping in. So we've got a 10-6 deuce. Now, it's kind of hard to say why that texture is being overbet, I guess. There's another 10-8-3 there. An 8-3 deuce. So, you know, it could be that they're fairly dry and there's overpairs in the aggressor's range. It's difficult to say. So we find a texture like that where, you know, we're wondering, okay, well, why is the 10-6 deuce apparently being overbet with some frequency? It's not an especially high bet frequency, but it's possible to open up the tree for this, or at least it should be. So that might be an interesting thing to check out. Let's see if I can remember. Okay, I think it's opened over here, right? 10-8-3. Was that the right board? Yeah, 10-8-3. Decent amount of overbetting. So let's just take a look at this, right? Was it really 10-8-3? That seems kind of good for the... I think there was another 10x board. It was 10-6-2 I was talking about initially, but not really sure what I did to actually load this texture up, to be honest with you. Okay, we just have to click on the numbers. All right. So we've got another window here. It's going to load up the 10-6-2. So basically, you can see pretty cool analysis feature is that any of those textures, if something seems interesting with the distribution, then we can actually just pull up the model. And you can do the same thing if you're using PSolver or GTO Plus. You can do exactly the same thing. It just requires you to have pre-solved the solutions, which probably cheaper in the long run, but I mean, there are other costs to consider as well, such as, you know, you're going to be using electricity to run a solve for quite a period of time. There's obviously a huge time commitment as well. All right, so we're seeing that according to this model, there is indeed quite a bit of overbetting that's taking place on this texture. It's not a texture we'd expect to be attacked with a very high frequency. It's almost, you know, it's fairly connected for the defender. It's not super connected, but it is just about what we classify as a dynamic texture. And we can see that the checking frequency is 62.5. So what that means is the checking frequency is above average. So we're going to bet this board less aggressively than an average board texture OP as the PFR. but for some reason there's a decent amount of overbetting that's taking place in the spot. So let's have a look first of all at the hands that overbet. And you can see there's a real mixture. Some of these, I guess, are flush draws, but you've also got things like King 3 of diamonds in the overbet range. Now, it's not necessarily something we're going to be doing in practice, but it's still interesting to see if we can figure out the reasons why. And part of the reason why we're going to have something like this is that there's going to be value hands in the range that end up being fairly polarized with respect to villain's defending range in the spot. So, if you think about a hand of poker from the flop onwards, the situation we're looking at, the basic objective or the basic way that a hand of poker goes down is one player is going to take on the role of aggressor, another player is going to take on the role of the defender. And as the hand progresses, as the aggressor keeps on taking aggressive actions and the defender keeps on cooling as opposed to taking an aggressive action, the range of the aggressor gets more and more polarized to the point where by the river he has a fairly polarized range where his river betting range is just going to be some strong hands for value and it's going to be some air hands that he uses as a bluff. Now we don't always see that on the flop. We see the polarized range beginning to form, but there's a lot of mid-strength hands that end up betting on the flop. So we don't really see that polarization until we get to the river. It's a picture that becomes cleaner and cleaner as we progress across the three streets. But on some textures, we start to see the polarization beginning to form a little bit earlier in the hands. And it's going to be based on the board texture. It's going to be based on the range versus range equity. And it's especially going to be based on the aggressor having those holdings that have the equity fairly locked in. There's still going to be ways those hands can be outdrawn, but there's going to be hands that the aggressor have which are doing very, very well, and in some cases beating every hand in the defender's range. And on those types of textures, first of all, we see an overbet range appear, and secondly, that allows us to start seeing the polarization appearing a lot earlier in the hand. So on this board, there are still some mid-range hands that bet. For example, we're still making use of the small bet sizing here. So it's not like a clean polarization. But if we just purely focus on the overbets, then we start to see polarization appearing in the hand a little bit earlier than we'd expect to. And also, when we have these kind of models, when we have this polarization occurring as well, it's very often on slightly drier textures where there's going to be a lot less interactivity in terms of draws. Outdrawing the value hands in the villain's overbet range. But we also see hands which are suspiciously weak in the overbet range. Now, in spots where they're very, very polarized, the betting range, we can sometimes, in fact, see very trashy hands overbetting the flop, hands that don't really seem like they should be overbetting. Whereas, depending on the extremity, and here I don't think it's a very extreme example, it seems that most of the overbets on this texture actually have something in the way of backdoor equity. They're not super strong, but if you look at the overbet range here, we've got King 3 of diamonds and King 3 of hearts. Now, King 3 of hearts is fairly obvious as an overbet. King 3 of diamonds, it's fairly weak, but it's not complete trash. It's got a backdoor straight with a 3, and it's got a backdoor flush with the diamonds. Let's have a look at some of the other overbets. We've got 3-5, so that's already a gut shot, so that's fine. 5-4. Let's have a look at some of these offsuit aces. So what's being overbet here? Well, check out that ace 4 of hearts. That's fairly speculative, right? That's in the overbet range some of the time. So ace of spades, 4 of hearts. Again, it does have a 1-card backdoor heart draw, and it's got the 1-card backdoor straight draw with the 4. But it's about as close to an air ball as you're going to get, I would imagine. There's the ace 4 with the ace of hearts. That at least has a backdoor flush draw. We've got an ace of diamonds, 4 of hearts. So that's fairly trashy as well. And ace of clubs, 4 of hearts. So some very weak holdings there. Same for ace 5. Ace 6 has a pair at least, so it's not super weak. Same thing really with ace 7 there, fairly weak. You can see that, you know, if we compare ace of hearts, 7 of diamonds to ace of diamonds, 7 of clubs, for example. Ace of diamonds, 7 of clubs is never overbet. But ace of hearts, 7 of diamonds is, or ace of diamonds, 7 of hearts is. So you can see it's not fully polarized to the extent where the absolute worst holdings in the range are being overbet. the solver is at least waiting until it has a heart in the hand, even if it's just something like the 7 of hearts or the 4 of hearts on this texture. But you can see it's fairly close to polarized. Now, if we have a look at the stronger hands in the range, we've got some fairly strong. In fact, I would say actually these are slightly vulnerable. Let's have a look at their equity. If we have a look, we can switch this on over to equity of those holdings. Actually, having said that, they are fairly strong and the equity is fairly locked in. Right, 80% equity with jacks against villain's range. We wouldn't necessarily expect it to be that strong, but I guess that's why the result seems fairly surprising, the amount of overbetting that was happening. So what we've done is we've pulled that out. We've seen the model itself. We've kind of explained why models end up this way, where you have some very strong hands that crush the rest of the range, and we start to see this polarization forming earlier on than we normally would. And that's also when we get these overbet sizings appearing. So apparently it's not just, ace-king exports, for example. It could also be something like a mid-range board that doesn't have intense connectivity. So if you think about this board, it's 10 high, and all of the overpairs are going to do fairly well. And of course, the big blind or the cold caller could have some hands that outdraw that and could have a bunch of equity, but on a 10-6 deuce, there's not actually any direct OESDs, so the most really the defender's going to have is maybe something like a pair that can make 2-pair trips, or a gut shot. So you can see that big blind has a hard time running down those overpairs in the aggressor's range, just because this board isn't as connected as it might be, which in turn gives a boost to the equity of these overpairs, and they start playing very well as part of polarized range. They can't really be outdrawn. They're very close to the nuts in this spot. I mean, pocket aces, 85% equity in this situation. You can, of course, see the concept of vulnerability coming in here as well, and I think it's good to keep this in mind as well. Very often, if we're betting a hand for protection, we don't bet too large, and it's simply because the hand is not usually that strong. But there are clearly exceptions. And also, something that's verified as a game theory principle is that if you have a very strong hand and you have another strong hand that's more vulnerable but slightly weaker, that slightly weaker, more vulnerable hand will actually bet larger in general. So you can kind of see this happening here with the pocket aces. It sometimes overbets, but it does a decent amount of checking and sometimes bets small. By the time we get to pocket jacks, it very rarely checks, and most of the time it overbets, and only sometimes bets small. So you can see a scaling increase in the amount of overbetting that happens as we go from aces to kings to queens to jacks. Jacks is betting more than queens, which is betting more than kings, which is betting more than aces. Aces is obviously stronger than jacks, and aces has more equity, but jacks suffers a lot more giving a free card, given that the big blind's still going to have some overcard combos in his range, presumably. By the time we get to pocket tens, and something that we may do some of the time as well, is we may tend towards bombing these combos, but very often top set's going to have that negative card removal effect as well. So we know that's kind of a GTO principle as well. Pocket tens gets mixed into the small sizing most of the time, and that's simply because it removes the 10x combos that the big blind can defend with. Now, what we might do, we'd probably, with our default exploitative line, is we'd actually play a mix with something like pocket tens in this spot. We definitely bet jacks plus, and we'd probably bet them as pure. So you can see we're not doing too badly there. If we have jacks plus, we're just going to bet all of those as pure strategies and probably never check. Tens, 10-6-2 is not drawy enough where we'd always check raise, but it's not safe enough where we'd always choose to bet. So this is going to actually be a mixed strategy for us in practice. And if we check, we'd probably check raise as well. So let's just see what happens. We can follow that part of the game tree as well. Let's imagine villain in position. Well, let's see what his sizings are. He does bet 4.5, a decent amount. And let's see what we do with pocket tens as a defender here. So we would almost exclusively be check raising that as part of our standard lines. But as you can see, it's actually check called a decent amount of the time. So we've still got those blocker effects going on. It weakens our opponent's range. You can see that GTO Wizard has this thing called blocker score as well. And the fact that it has a very high blocker score, presumably it's not necessarily a good thing right now, because it's basically saying, hey, villain doesn't have pocket 10s now because we've got 2 of the 10s. He doesn't even have a lot of 10x hands. So what it means is that it's a lot more likely he's semi-bluffing. It's obviously going to struggle to continue with those semi-bluffs against a check raise. So you can see the solve is actually mostly check calling here. We would probably just check raise anyway and say, well, maybe our opponent will just continue with their gut shots or backdoor flush draws or whatever they have. So we're not necessarily going to be check calling here. We just check raise. And in terms of EV, well, there's not actually a difference between the two options. It's just that if we always check raise, we'd technically be check raising too much from a GTO perspective. But for a hand to be mixed in to the check calling and check raising range, then it's basically saying the EV of the two lines is the same anyway. So if we go back to our decision node, which is the Cbet or check node, let's see if there's anything else that we've missed. There's obviously quite a few overbets, very similar in their construction. It's going to be like a direct flush draw or a backdoor flush draw. Ace 10 is also apparently strong enough to mix into the overbet range. So it's not necessarily always a play we'd think about. But the scenario here is we open something like Ace 10, big blind defends, board is 10-6 deuce. We'd probably mostly just bet this for normal sizing, and if we had the Ace of Hearts combo, we'd be more likely to mix it into the checking range some of the time, that kind of thing. And you can see it is a mixed strategy between bets and checks, so that's completely fine. But an upgrade we could potentially consider here is the overbet sizing, and the basic logic here is that if we have a look at the ranges, presumably big blind just doesn't have any overpairs in his range. You can see the big blind's range here. We've got the small blind range in blue here, and as you can see, we have a fairly considerable nutted equity advantage here. Now, there are a couple of hands in the big blind's range that are strong. You can see these lines almost interact here, so let's see what that's generated by. It's generated by the Ace 10 of Hearts being a very high equity holding, and also we've got 2s and 6s in the big blind's range. You can see there's a little bit of competition there, but aside from those few combos, for the rest of the whole top 25% of the range, for example, we can see that small blind is absolutely crushing big blind. And you can see as part of that region, this is where we have the things like Ace 10, Jacks, that kind of thing in the small blind's range. So there's Queens, for example. So by the time we get to that part of the range, yeah, the big blind's got some 10x, but those don't have super great equity against overpairs, if we think about the hand versus hand equity. So we can kind of see why the range is constructed this way. Although there is more competition at the top of the range than there would be on something like an Ace King Deuce, for example, that nutted equity advantage, well, it basically just doesn't stop. It just continues through the whole top 25%, and then also the top 50%, and then there's basically no point where the big blind can really do a good job of defending, and that's why we see the large sizing there used. Alright, so I think we pretty much covered everything on this texture. We understand why this board is functioning the way it is, so we can just get rid of that, and we can just head back to our overall distribution here. So we've kind of sussed that out. We already kind of know why Ace King X boards function the way they do. And again, if you weren't sure, we could just bring up something like that. So this is Ace King 8 at the same decision node, and it's once again a board where we see these polarized ranges start to occur early on in the hand. It's going to be less mid-range stuff betting on this kind of texture. I mean, if you think about what is a mid-range hand for small blind, well, it's basically a King X, right? That's a mid-strength hand. So King Jack, King 10, well, these hands don't really make very good overbets. They don't even really make very good bets. Those hands are going to be pure checks for us. Whereas if you think about Ace King, well, that's a hand that can basically almost never be beaten by the big blind's range, because big blind doesn't have Ace King. In fact, even Ace Queen, it's very hard for these hands to lose. Now, if we have a look at the equity, there are some things they lose against, but you can see generally 89.9% equity for Ace King offsuit. Even Ace Queen has 83% equity. If we have a look at the range versus range breakdown, once again, you can see that the range advantage is just huge here, and there's a fairly pronounced nutted equity advantage here for the small blind. Now, if we go back to the other kinds of textures, let's see if we can find something that's a little bit more incentivized for a smaller bet sizing. We've kind of ordered by large sizing here. So if we order by small bet sizing, let's see what kind of textures really like a small bet sizing but don't really overbet too much. Now, we've seen a lot of those ace-ace-x boards. One of the ones that we'll probably find is some kind of ace-high, fairly dry texture, like the ace-9-3. So this board, it's just not going to be overbetting as much. So let's have a look at how that's going to be played here. We're going to expect a very high betting frequency, but we're not really going to see any overbets. So this is the ace-9-3 rainbow. And you can see just everything is mixed into the betting range with a fairly high frequency, apart from the more mid-strength hands. We've got things like kings, which are going to be checked at a fairly high frequency. Let's have a look at what those 9x are doing as well. Even the 9x, by the time you get to 9x, because they're fairly vulnerable, they're going to bet at a high frequency. Basically, everything just bets at a high frequency. If we have a look at the range versus range, there's a bit more of a competition here at the top of the range. You can see the main advantage starts developing in this 25% here. In fact, there's a dip here in the big blinds range. So you can see it's kind of like from 50 to 75%. It's a deeper range advantage, but there's more competition at the top of the range. So you can see the strongest hand in the small blinds range is aces, but then, you know, big blind has pocket nines. Both players have ace nine. Big blind's got ace 3 as well, and, you know, pocket threes. So really, all of the very strong hands, big blind has them as well. By the time we get to ace king, ace queen, these hands are still doing fairly well, but you can see there's already a few hands stronger than that the big blind's going to have. Let's have a look at the equity here as well. Let's just see what the equities look like. And you can see, actually, these hands have a ton of equity as well. Like ace-king, 87%, ace-queen, 87.6%, etc. These hands have a huge amount of equity. But they're obviously not super strong in the same way that some of the hands on the other textures were. They're also less vulnerable. I mean, if you think about like the jacks we saw in the 10xx, and now think about something like ace-8 offsuit on the ace-9-3. It's got a ton of equity. It's got 84% equity in the spot. But it's probably not going to get outdrawn that much. So that's one difference between this texture and something like the 10-8 or the 10-6x that we saw. You know, there's actually more raw equity on this texture than the 10-high board that we saw. But the jacks on the 10-high board, they're high equity, but they're fairly vulnerable. Whereas here, ace-8 offsuit is very high equity. It's just not really that vulnerable. And also, if it does start trying to bet too big, well, we know the big blind does have things like pocket threes, ace-9, and ace-3. So he actually has quite a few combos of hands that ace-7 won't do so well against if it tries to bet so big. So these kind of textures are typically the ones that we bet small. So keep in mind there's a fairly big difference between an ace-king X, which is bet at a fairly high frequency and has overbets, and then something like ace-9-3, which is still bet at a very high frequency, but it's mostly going to be generated by those smaller bet sizings. So just less vulnerability going on this kind of texture, and slightly less of a nutted advantage just because some of the really high equity hands are still behind some of the big blinds calling range in this spot. So our main takeaway is why those boards are different, or just that they are different. Something like ace-9 deuce versus ace-king deuce, for example. You'll see most of those boards bet at a high frequency are the ones with high cards. In fact, if we sort by flop, I think this should be sorted by high cards. You can see it's sorted by high cards. We see a very general trend towards more betting aggression as we get to the slightly higher textures, but it's not going to be completely correlational because obviously we've got those trips textures, stuff like that. Okay, let's have a look which boards. Are best in terms of EV. So what are the absolute best boards? Well, it is those Broadway boards. but I'm sure we'll do fairly well on like the A7-2, stuff like that. Let's have a look at equity actually as well. Yeah, so anything with multiple broadways is going to be best in terms of equity. And you can kind of see that going into this, and part of the reason for this is that the big blind just defends super wide against a small blind open. You can see at the top end of the spectrum, you've got range versus range 58.3 for the small blind, but then the absolute worst boards for the aggressor still has 49.7. So that kind of tells us that actually small blind had an equity advantage going into this before we even saw the flop. And part of the reason for that is big blind is supposed to defend super wide and just accept the fact that he's going to have a range versus range equity advantage on pretty much every flop. You know, aside for some really specific flops down here like the 6-5-4 offsuit, which is basically the nut flop for the big blind in the situation. But it's okay to have that equity disadvantage on pretty much every texture because of the discount we get on the pre-flop calls. So closing the action, we're not investing a full half of the pot. The big blind we've paid in the big blind is already part of the pot, so we're just investing 2 big blinds into a total pot of 6 big blinds, etc. So that's why it's acceptable to defend really wide and have this EV disadvantage. You can see most of these around this area are going to be like the 10 high and the 9 high type boards. So, you know, just keep in mind, even though the 10-6 deuce was overbet with some frequency, it doesn't mean that it's a good board for the PFR. It just means overbetting is incentivized. As we get to the boards that are higher EV, they invariably have a high card, basically. Or 2 high cards, or they may be paired dry. So there's obviously a lot of information you can kind of extract here. Let's pick a texture, just to finish off, let's pick a texture that is what we'd consider very, very good for the defender. But by the way, there's some other outputs as well we can just check out here as well. So this is high cards. Obviously, if the deuce is a high card, it means it's a trips board, right? Betting frequency across different textures. You can see there's a fairly loose correlation. For some reason, queen high boards are bet the most, but you can see that generally there's an increase as we get towards the higher cards. Suits. So this is just a very general metric as well. The small blind should be c-betting the most aggressive on rainbow textures, then two-tone textures, then monotone textures are actually the least aggressively bet boards. So that's kind of different from our standard lines. But you can see GTO-wise, the more suits there are on the board, the less aggressively we are supposed to bet. And let's have a look. Pairing. So again, you can see fairly simple correlation there. Paired boards. Well, you can see that we pretty much never overbet on paired boards. You can kind of see the average aggregate strategy for playing on every single paired board. And you can see strong tendency towards using that smaller sizing there, but bet at a higher frequency than not paired. But the not paired boards are the ones that can be overbet some of the time. You can see there's no actual overbet there. You know, we can just ignore this 0.3%. So we can simplify that and say paired boards are not supposed to overbet. You don't want to overbet in range there. They are bet more aggressively than non-paired textures, but not even the half pot sizing is really used there. It's actually 46.8%, so 1/3 Cbet sizing. The not paired boards, well, you can see that on average, across every unpaired board, the solver is still preferring to use the 1/3 sizing. In practice, I don't really like to bet 1/3 here. I'm more likely to bet half pot, just because I think 1/3 gives the in-position player too good of a price. But you can see GTO doesn't really care about that and says, actually, Cbet 1/3 OOP is actually the most common sizing you should be using given this specific game tree. So there's actually nothing wrong with that 1/3 sizing OOP. Tripled. Now this is kind of one of our unorthodox textures, which is really one of the boards that we want to attack too aggressively. It's like double paired, for example. We don't really bluff too much on tripled, but it looks like that's not quite the right thing to do from a GTO perspective. So keep in mind, everything has a full house draw on a 3 of a kind texture. So if anything, after seeing this, I probably would just play hyper aggressively on these textures. It doesn't matter that we get very low full equity here. So obviously what we've done is looked at this and said, well, this is not a good board to bluff. We don't have any full equity, so if we have zero equity hand, it's probably not worth it. But here's the thing, pretty much nothing is zero equity on a trips board. Everything is a full house draw, especially if we have overcards. You know, we've got like king jack on a deuce 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 board, for example. Well, we're drawing to the nut full house in that case. So if anything, we want to ramp up our aggression on those textures. So it's kind of a refinement that we can make here. Connectedness, let's have a look. So I'm not 100% sure what is connected and disconnected. We'd kind of need to see some examples of this. But what we can take away from this is that disconnected boards should be bet at a higher frequency. And connected boards should be bet at a lower frequency. Now just looking at the sizing there, disconnected, well, they're bet more frequently overall. Both boards seem to prefer the smaller sizing. But let's just think about this proportionally for a minute. So we've got 31 here. So this is, it's kind of like 15%, right, of the smaller sizing. You know, just relationally. Whereas here for the connected, it's a much bigger proportion, right? It's almost like 33% of the size. So it does seem, you know, when we factor in that we're just checking a lot more anyway on these kind of textures, it does seem like the larger sizings might be slightly more important. But then again, we've got the 4.5 here on the disconnected. I think we can't really draw too much conclusion from such vague categories, and that's why my initial reaction is, hey, we actually need to see some examples of what a connected and disconnected texture is in this case. Okay, so we can apply some filters to this. So if we wanted to find a board which was, you know, fairly typical of a board that's good for the defender, we can take something like, well, we can filter exactly for what we want to, 10-9-7. We can also experiment with what disconnected and connected boards actually are here just by choosing this as the filter. And if we just go back to all flops, now you can see here we're just getting all of the 10-9-7 boards. So very powerful filter, in fact. Very, very easy. I'm guessing if you had all this data in GTO Plus, you could do the same thing, but there isn't obviously this interface, this API for quickly filtering different types of board texture. So there are some advantages to this method. Of course, the downside is it just costs more money, right? You know, this is what, $80 a month or something, whereas GTO Plus is like $70 lifetime, but it's going to involve a lot more work. But the end result's going to be the same. So it really depends. What do you want, expediency or do you want cheapness? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. But depending on what your priorities are, this might be a good solution, or it might be better to build your own trees with GTO Plus. One of the other advantages of using something like GTO Plus is that you have to put in the work to build the tree. Now that might sound like a bad thing, but it gets you thinking intelligently about which different bet sizings are incentivized at each decision node in the game tree. And because it's getting you thinking about the game on that granular level, it's also improving you as a player at the same time. Whereas here, because a lot of the work has been done, it's fairly simple to just look at the result and not really understand the significance of the different bet sizings that have been chosen as part of the tree, that kind of thing. So, you know, the downside here is you might miss out on a good learning opportunity if you don't build the tree yourself. So it's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. Anyway, let's have a look at this 10-9-8. We've just gone for 10-9-8 because it's worse. And let's just fire up this board texture. Right, so we can see Overbet, not really so much of a thing on this texture. If we just start with the range versus range equity, you can see both players are kind of tied here in the nutted equity distribution. Small blind is still doing well for the rest of the range, but we know that's because small blind has a range advantage going into the hand. This is still a texture that favors the big blind. It just doesn't favor the, you know, it just favors the big blind enough that his equity is boosted, but not enough that he has more than 50% equity overall with his range on this texture. But you can see there's no real huge nutted advantage here. You can see that the nuts is Queen Jack, and it might be the case that both players have all combos of Queen Jack. Let's just have a look. It looks like the small blind doesn't have all combos of Queen Jack offsuit, probably because it has a completing range, whereas it seems the big blind does have pretty much all combos. So you can see, if anything, it looks like it might be a small nutted equity advantage for the big blind here, simply because he has all combos of Queen Jack according to this. Let's see the Queen Jack suited as well. Well, small blind seems to have all of the Queen Jack suited, whereas big blind maybe 3-bet some of them pre. But you can see it's fairly close. It looks like the big blind may have a slight nutted equity advantage on this texture. So what that means is it's going to be very hard for small blind to incorporate a large bet sizing range. And, although this is not bad in the sense that small blind still has the most equity with his range, it's clearly going to be a texture where there's not a lot of aggression for the small blind. And you can see the betting frequency here hardly ever sizes up, and the betting frequency is 17.5% for the 1/3 pot sizing for small blind here, which results in a checking frequency of almost 80%. So, this is going to be one of the worst boards. We saw the average betting frequency is about 40%, whereas on these kind of textures, it should be about 20%. And this is why, if we are looking through hand to note, and we're doing the analysis with the Death Star HUD, and we're breaking it down by board texture, we expect to see round about 20% betting frequency here on code red textures. Now, we're not necessarily betting the same hands as the solver. We are playing a lot more hands pure. You can see everything's mixed here. We're actually selecting very specific combos and playing them as either pure bets or pure checks. Let's just see what ATM says. Can we node lock in GTO Wizard? No, you can't node lock in GTO Wizard ATM. And at least I don't think you can. And the reason is that this is a pre-solved solution. So the idea is when you node lock something, it means you're changing the tree. And then you rerun the solve with the node lock in place. That's something you do with GTO Plus. This is not that. We don't build the trees ourselves here with GTO Wizard. These are pre-solved solutions. So if the guys at GTO Wizard decided to node lock the tree for some unknown reason, and then gave us the solved solutions, then they would have effectively put in a node lock in place for us. Not that they do that, but we can't node lock ourselves because we are just purely browsing pre-solved solutions here. This is not even a solver we're looking at. This is just a web interface that passes solver output and just shows us the output in a nice web format. There's no actual solver that we're using here. We're just looking at a solution in a specific output. But we can't run a solve here. That's not what this is, because everything is a pre-solved solution. So this is not a solver we're working with now. This is a nice interface for filtering pre-solved solutions. Node lock is a change you make to the tree. And that kind of implies you're in control of the tree. Here, we're not in control of the tree. We can just see the solutions, but the guys at GTO Wizard are the guys who created the tree in this case. So that's another advantage. It's kind of useful that came up. That's another advantage of something like GTO Plus or PS Solver, is you can create any tree you want with any bet sizings you want. Whereas here, you can only use their pre-solved solutions. Having said that, they offer quite a few different solutions. So you can see here, for cash, which is really the only ones that I'm interested in, 6 max, there's a whole bunch of different stack size. So all of these are, sold for at least most of these stack size. I don't know for every single stack size. And for each stack size, there's different selections as well. So you have like complex, simple, basic, and they basically have different bet sizing ranges on the post-flop decision nodes. So depending on the level of complexity, for example, complex, it just has a very large amount of different bet sizing options post-flop, to the point where it might be too complex. But if you want a really, really smooth idea of exactly which sizings are incentivized, then complex could be a great idea. All right, so on that note, we appear to have partially crashed GTO Wizard. That's fine. Let's just go back. So we can just click on, I can't remember exactly which one we had. But anyway, it's possible to load up this spot in different trees as well. And just see how the solver plays when it has a different set of ranges available. So I guess in some ways that's kind of like node locking. If you were to go to a different tree that had different options, well, the options from the previous tree are now locked out, that kind of thing. But that's about as close as you're going to get with this. Alright, so that's pretty much it for Cbet OP solver module. If you guys have any questions, just let me know in the chat right now. I'm just going to spend another 30 seconds just looking through this tree to see if there's anything that we missed. So if we take something like premium, it's mixed. So this is the kind of combo that currently we're just playing as a pure check raise in the spot. But you can see it is mostly checked, but it's sometimes bet. And let's follow the game tree through to the point where it bets. Sorry, it checks and then faces a bet. Let's see if it's a pure check raise or it's mixed. So again, something that we probably might not do in practice exploitatively is you can see that after facing the float bet, Queen Jack is sometimes check raising. It's actually check calling most of the time rather than check raising. So it's obviously to protect the check calling range. You know, if we didn't have these hands, maybe it'd be possible for big blind to overbet or something on the turn. But we're probably just going to check raise this 100% frequency. Other hands that get check raised, even jacks, we probably wouldn't play it this way. We'd probably have jacks as a pure check call. Tens, I think we would have tens as a pure bet rather than a check to begin with. So you can see we're basically playing fairly similarly in terms of overall frequencies, but we're switching everything to pures. But it's still good to understand how GTO plays, and when we employ a pure strategy, understand how we're deviating from GTO and how we would reset to a GTO strategy if we needed to at some point hypothetically. So playing exploitatively is not a valid reason for not understanding how GTO works. So you can see GTO, Queen Jack is check raised a lot, which would be our most common line, but it is also check called a lot in this particular scenario. Another thing that can be interesting is to see, well, what happens if the float bet's really small? You can see Queen Jack does get check raised now more aggressively, but it's still mostly check calls, even against a 1/3 float bet. Alright, so let's wrap things up. Hopefully you guys found it helpful. Good luck with the grind, and I'll see you next time. One more thing actually as well, just in case you're interested in GTO Wizard, that's my affiliate code there as well. You get 10% off your first purchase, etc. So if you want a discount, then there you go. Alright, good luck guys. Happy crushing.